And to talk us through this week's property data, I spoke with REA Group's Angus.
It's set to be pretty busy this weekend, particularly Sydney and Melbourne. We're seeing, in Sydney, auction volumes up 50% roughly compared to the same time last year, and in Melbourne up about a bit over a third. So that's a pretty strong increase from what we were seeing last year. Part of the story there is just last year was pretty quiet. Spring last year, we were seeing the RBA raise interest rates very quickly. Prices were falling, so it was a pretty quiet spring. So this year looks very strong by comparison, but it's not the only thing going on there. It has actually been fairly busy this spring in Sydney and Melbourne, and a lot of that's just down to relatively strong selling conditions. Prices are rising, homes are selling fairly quickly, not as quickly as we were seeing, say, 18 months ago, but still quicker than pre-pandemic. And auction clearance rates have been fairly firm. They've come off a little in recent weeks, but not a lot, and certainly don't change the picture of pretty strong conditions overall.
Now, despite it being a busy weekend, unfortunately, it's not a first home buyers market. We've seen the rates of first home buyers decrease over the last 2 years, obviously with interest rate rises. Do you see this continuing?
Yeah, it's certainly been one of the big stories that we've seen change compared to 2021. 2021 was actually a really busy year for first home buyers. We saw about 160,000 of them across that calendar year. It's the second busiest year for first home buyers in 2.5 decades or more, just behind 2009 when, kind of post-GFC. So pretty busy year. That's really changed as interest rates have risen. 2022, we saw about 30% fewer first home buyers, and then this year's been quieter again. Obviously we're not the whole way through the year, but thus far we're down about 10 to 15%, so quite a bit quieter than what we were seeing at peak. The reason for that is just affordability. We've seen a huge increase in interest rates. Prices have stayed pretty high. Incomes are growing, but they haven't grown enough to offset that. It means first home buyers can't borrow as much as they used to be able to. There just aren't as many homes that they can afford to buy, and so we've seen a lot of them pull out of the market. Unfortunately, that's probably not going to change much next year. We're not likely to see interest rates fall. We might, but it's not going to make a big difference, and property prices thus far have continued to grow.
And of course, because of this now, I want to chat to you about intergenerational living, because we're seeing a lot of this now. We've seen grandparents coming in, living with parents and children across 3, sometimes even 4 generations. Do you see this lasting, and for how long?
Yeah, it's an interesting trend, and I think it's related to what we saw during the pandemic in terms of changes in household size. One of the things that happened during the pandemic when rents fell, it's hard to remember that now, but in 2020 and 2021, rents actually did fall. What we saw was a lot of people break up their share houses. You go from living in a 4-person terrace in Newtown to living those 4 people in 3 smaller apartments around the city, and they could afford to do that. As rents have risen, as rental markets have got really tight, as housing affordability's worsened, that's going to start to reverse. People will move back into share houses, into intergenerational living. We're seeing some signs of that. So Flatmates, which is part of REA Group, has had its busiest year ever. A lot of people looking for that share accommodation to kind of defray the cost of rent of housing.
Now, Angus, before we let you go, let's talk about this week's unemployment figures. Can you give us some of the data on this? And do you believe that the results will potentially see the RBA raise rates once again next month or even into February, taking into the fact that we actually just had one last week?
Yeah, it's a great question. We certainly saw that was the big news out this week was, the unemployment rate was up a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit. And, while that is soft, it remains very, very low. And part of the story for why it was up was actually the labour force participation rate. So that is people looking for work as well as those in work actually increased. And employment also grew. So it was kind of a bit of a mixed bag, I think. And so if I were the RBA, I'd be looking at that. I don't think it would change my view. And given that we saw them raise their forecast for inflation, they're expecting it to take longer. I think it probably hasn't changed their view that there's still scope for further interest rate increases. Probably not in December is my view. I think we'll probably see it early next year once they get another read on inflation in February, or get read on inflation for last year in February's board meeting. That's when I think we might see them raise interest rates, but a lot will depend on what that inflation read looks like.
Yes, absolutely. Angus, thank you for your time.
Absolute pleasure, Hortensia.